Recording, yes. Render props. What is render props? Render props. Example. Yeah. Again, this might seem what's written there. It's exactly the same thing I said about children, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to share and reuse your code. And again, and this is also it's one of those things that it's good to know, but you don't have to use it for anything, unless of course on a homework it specifically says use render props for this. That just basically tells you to train to understand what's the purpose of it. But it's basically a component that it's not really a visual component. It's more like for utilities. We will see the example. It's easier when we look at an example, when we explain. So now this crazy application here, I think I have a render props somewhere. What's all these errors that I get here? Marker regarding repository, but its value is no description. I'll just try to get rid of that error first. It's annoying. So git home, repositories, repository. Description is not required because not all of them have description. Okay, now that error is a different one. We don't care. So first, I will try to find where did I put the render props example because it's somewhere. I'll close all this stuff. Counter. I think it's on the header. Yeah, it is. So, okay. Don't look at the code. Yeah, okay. Oh, damn it. Oh, yeah, I don't need this thing. And this thing. So now we are going to be looking at this part here in between our hello and our add new. So this, as you can see, it's a very simple counter. This is something we can do already with a use state and one component and two buttons, right? It's very easy to do, very, very simple. And again, it always brings that question, then why do we need render props to do something so simple? It's just an example. It's not, because it might seem a bit complicated when you look at it. So that counter here, when you look at it, we are doing this. So we have a component called counter that I'm importing up there, and we will see how that one looks. And then now on this counter, we have a render function, which looks like a prop, and it is also. And then we have a lot of brackets and parentheses, and we have increment, decrement, count. And then inside here, we have another, it's not React element, but it's JSX element, HTML. And in here, we are printing out render props. We have count, which is this value here. And then we have a button on click decrement, which is come from there. And then we have a button on click increment, which is from there and from there. And one is -1, another one is +1. So as you can see, this again, it's a counter, and a counter doesn't change that much, right? It should always have an increment, a decrement, and what's the current value. But what's the magic behind it, right? Like, how does this actually work? And how it works is by doing this. I will put it side by side, close this guy, put here. So our counter component here, which is the one we are having there, takes in a render. And again, this is another keyword like children. There's a keyword render. And then when you look inside, it's very simple. As I said, like that's exactly how we made a counter in the first day, I think. I don't think we made it going down, but so we have a state starts at 0 with count and set count. Then we have a function called increment that sets count to whatever value plus 1, and we have a function decrement that set count to whatever value minus 1. But now in here, instead of having the buttons here to say go up, go down, we are actually returning the whole thing, basically, as a render. So what we are saying is like, oh, this render function here, give back a count, a decrement, and an increment, which basically is count, increment, and decrement. So back here, whenever we say counter, on our render, we actually have these three, count, increment, and decrement, and we can use it like that. And for instance, one case that you see this type of situation would be that instead of a counter would be the one that fetches the data. Because when you're fetching the data, there is that moment where you don't have data yet, and then you have data. And imagine if your API is wrong, you might have an error. So you have three cases for that. You have a data case, you have an error case, and you have a loading case. And as you can imagine, we could build a component that returns loading data and error. And then, of course, in here we need to build all the logic for it with use effect, and with state, and all that stuff. The same thing we already did to fetch data. And then we can always use our data component to say like, oh, if it's loading, then do something. If there is data, then do something. And if there is error, then do something. And but again, that case is not, people don't use it that often because it's a bit hard to maintain, let's say. But it is one case I've seen quite a lot of it. But for instance, in this counter, we of course can use this anywhere, and as you can see, like this is probably more code than you would use to actually make your own counter. That's true. But for instance, if we go now to the footer again, let's punish the footer, just to have two things, and I'll copy the whole thing. So footer, children, and now HR here. Counter, probably need to import. Let's clean it here. Count, decrement. Now, for instance, here in the footer, we only have decrement because for some reason we only want decrement. We don't care about that one. We can actually even remove it from here. So, and this one still is the same. And basically, this component is pure functionality. There is no visual on it. So again, this render props is, maybe that's an understatement, I don't know, but it's more used for functionality things and not visual things. Because then the visual, we can always do it here. Because this is what's going to get printed. None from here going to get printed. This only sets count and returns all that, basically.
Marco,
yeah.
It's just like when you call the render down and you pass as also props inside the render. Its return should be return HTML or it can return something else.
Here on this side.
Yeah, like for example, you can do something with the result like count. You can do something like count plus 1 or something like that.
In here.
Yeah, it's like.
That would
render
be.
It's like a function is return direct and HTML. It's can't like do something and then return.
No, because the logic would be on this side. This is exactly to isolate the logic in one place and then have the presentation in another. So in here you can do all the crazy things. I mean, again, we have we can actually just do one more, for instance.
Will you be able to do like the drop down that way? The drop down that we just looked at it.
Yes, but the drop down has a lot of visual as well. Because we want to print the select and we want to print the option as well, and all those are HTML components. So that fits on its own component. Of course, that because we have two drop downs, one for language, one for themes. Then yes, we could make it so that all the logic would appear here, and then we would make it pretty, or even different pretty for one and for another. But for that could be the use case. But for instance, here we can put double count times 2. So now, for instance, on a counter, I created a double function that, again, sets state of count times 2, but I'm not passing it back here yet. So in here, I cannot. This probably gives me an error somewhere. If I try to use it, for instance, okay, I'll actually put both, or no, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, nothing really happens because even though like I have a function here, but does not exist. It's not defined. I mean, it is defined here, but we are not passing it back. So now if I do this, now double, I'm actually passing it back. I mean, it's not really back, but it's just because in here we have counter and then render, so it's like it's kind of back and forward. To explain more. So now in here, if we go all the way down and we multiply, now we are doing this function here. So again, this would be a way to make your code reusable. Again, it's the same concept of children, not the same concept. It's a different concept, but the same way of children. It's like, but when should I use this? And it's also one of those things, like it's really hard to say when, because again, an example like this, it's a bit does not really blow our minds, but we can try to build the fetching like this, because that would be something that actually would get us a bit more into it.
Can you also pass a function with just the ordinary state? Like you're not using render props. Like if ever I on the button unclick and then the double and then on the main component, it's really hard to explain because I'm basing it on the week 3 homework where the if you click on the edit, so it will. The description will be automatically as input, and then if you type in anything, and then the edit will change into update, and then whatever the new value of the input is, you will be passed it into the array. So you can there's a way that I can use the same logic without using really render props, or I really need to have a render so that I can pass the function.
No, I mean those functions can always be passed as a prop of the component. For instance, actually, I think we have it somewhere here. If I find on the repositories, because for instance, in here, I'm passing this function of handle delete as a prop of the component, and then on the repository component, I can use that function because I have it here as a prop. And again, yes, you can rewrite your code to use render props. It's just like it is a bit confusing to do that. I think it's always easier in the beginning to always, if you need a function in another component, just pass it as a prop of that component. And then you can, because for instance in here, as you can see on this component, we do not have any function called on delete. We just receive it, and then on this button on click we call it. But then, of course, it's the responsibility of the parent to have that function, and I think we have it defined, yeah, here. So actually you can see this is the inverse logic of the render props.
Yes.
Because this is actually the parent giving the children, here's the functions for you.
Uh-huh.
And the render props is more of having one component that has all the logic and then gives to whoever wants to use it.
Yeah, that is
So-
basically the homework is after you change the description, you will pass it again to the parent so that you will update the list. And then if you render again, then the new list with the new name will be displayed.
Yeah, but that also happens if you do it as a prop function.
Okay.
It's
With
just
this
that
one, with the render props or just the ordinary?
just the ordinary.
Ah.
Like, both of them work. I mean, and that's my opinion, honestly. The render props one might be a bit more complicated to figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
Because it has to be very abstract. It has to be very like, I mean, there is no visual on it. There is nothing that we can actually see. Is it working? And on this one, we can always create a function on a parent that says handle edit. For instance, does something, whatever. I will just create it. This happens in the parent. And now on a repository, edit, on edit or whatever, and I'll just create a button for it, nothing very fancy. And now here on edit, I need to handle edit, right? Yeah. So for instance, in here, as you can see, the console log is from the parent.
Yeah.
So this is a way of sending data back to the parent, basically. Now, the thing is that you want to send something from the child to the parent, because this one, basically, we send whatever we want, right?
Yeah.
So what we can do here is to have a name, right? Name. Now, in here, we do not send in parentheses because that's still completely valid. And on a repository, so that we have them side by side. Oh yeah, I need the yeah, I need it here then, isn't it? Nope. Then okay, this one, it doesn't. Is it this one that has to? Yeah, but this got triggered every time, so is in here that we need that. Oh, okay, yeah. So in here we are actually sending data from the children. So if we want to send the name, just to make sure that we are sending the right data per each one of them.
Ah, okay.
So for instance, this one is called agent experience. So when we click, is that one. When we click, is that one, and it all happens in a parent.
Okay.
And again, yes, we could create a render props for this, but we would have to change so much of our code, at least at this stage, that I would say, no, send it as a prop. And just to, I mean, we cannot see it here, but I have it there on edit, just to, yeah. Because, where do we have to delete? So that I can actually show the differences between handle delete and handle edit. So the parent defines two functions, handle delete and handle edit.
Yeah.
Now the delete requires an ID. The edit requires a name. In this stage, when we are calling the repository, the delete, in here we are actually saying, basically we are sending a function and we are not calling a function. That's basically what the difference between this one and this one. So, and because we are sending a function, we need to send all of it. We need to send the function and the parameters.
Okay.
So that's why in here we are sending the index. Also because we know what's the index at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
But on the edit, because we don't know what's the new name of it yet, so we are just sending the function with no parentheses because we don't know the rest. Because if we would try to send with the arrow, with the arrow function kind of it, then we would require to send everything.
Okay.
And then on this side, I'm importing them both the same way. Where are they? Yeah. Then whenever I click delete, then it triggers that one, which basically triggers handle delete with index, whatever index. I already received it. I don't need to recalculate that stuff. But on the edit, I actually do it. I am doing that. Now, if, let's say, part of our props would be ID as well, then the handle delete could be exactly the same. Because then we would have we have an ID here, so we know exactly, we can say on delete and then with the ID of that. So both of these are completely valid. They are different, and both of them gets triggered on the parent.
Marco, why is it that you cannot just pass on edit and the parenthesis name? Why do you have to have an arrow function?
It's for the click handler, basically. Because every event has an event handler. How can I show that? Okay, if I create a button here.
So like a callback, isn't it?
Not much. So on click, and we do this. Yeah, but now we need, because, okay, here, I will just event. First we do this. So event just printed out event, basically. Now, if we would do this, now event got triggered 7 times.
Right away.
Because we are doing console log now. Like we are not waiting for the on click event.
Okay. That's
Because the on click,
interesting.
on other ways of writing, this is this. It's a function that happens there. So it gets triggered all the time. So by doing this, we make sure that it only gets triggered once it clicks. And for instance, here you can call this whatever you want. I call it usually E to make it short. And you can actually see what the, which one was it? This one, yeah. And this is like everything that the button on click has, basically. So I mean, there's a lot of crazy data that we don't need for anything. Sometimes we need to get the value, for instance, for the drop down. That's exactly where we get the value from. We where was it? And there, yeah, that's in here on change. There is an E, which is an event, and then we have a target and a value. Now in this one, I don't think we even have a target, do we? Yeah, we do. Yeah, it's null because it's a button, and a button does not really have a target, I think. Again, that's up to the HTML element of what does it have. But yeah, this would be a way of a function. Again, you might wonder like how come this one does not get triggered?
Yeah.
Right, and the reason is because we are not doing this. We are actually not calling it. We are just
assigning
passing it. Yeah, we're just like use this, because you actually cannot use it like this. You actually need to pass a name, basically, because the function requires a name.
Yeah,
So by doing something like this, then you can do your edit on child, and when you press save or whatever it is, Of course, that you need to have some state to say like, is it being edited or not? So you can show the button different or something like that. But that's completely irrelevant for what happens here.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course this can be a new name instead of the previous name. But
So
but yeah,
automatically the value of that will be passed
Yeah.
to the one who.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, but again, it would be the same thing of doing this. But now the handle delete needs an ID, and we are not sending it anywhere. So now this one needs to send it. Basically, the reason why I did that is because, oh, now we need an ID here, and then this one needs to send the ID. Then they just do it on a parent, because we don't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just extra work to send and send back and send back. But well, let me yeah.
I really thought that the edit would really need to have a return value of the new name so that it would
Yeah.
go, but actually it just automatically handles the data right away.
Yeah. For instance, I mean, and this will be a bit weird, but if we do something like this, oh yeah, but now we need to find, yeah. Yeah, because in here we actually don't need only the name, we will also need the ID, because we need to find what is the current one, unless the name is unique or something like that. But for instance, just for the sake of it, I will do so ID and name. Now in here we are gonna send ID as index, and here we have an ID somewhere. So here we have ID and name. Right. So now if we say, oh, new value of this ID equals the new name, and then I'm gonna set the same here, something like this. I'm not sure if it's gonna work. It's edit is marked as required, but it's not. Okay, did something wrong. Oh, dot name, right? We don't want to change the whole thing. Yeah. And we send per one, each, because I mean, I mean, this is not the prettiest way to do, but we are just saying like, oh, this ID, the name, update to this one. It's not ugly to do. There is other ways, but it's just one of the ways to do, of course. But for instance, it's true that all this functionality, as you can see here, handle, delete, handle, edit, handle, new, could very easily become this.
Yeah.
Because then in here you have your entire repository list or to-do list on your render. I mean, of course you would call it, I don't know, to-dos, handlers, whatever. And then you give back handle delete, handle new, and whatever, and all the logic happens here only.
Okay.
But again, this I would say it is a very good exercise to do, but it's not easy. I mean, at least I'm saying for myself. Sometimes I get to points where like, yeah, this would be cool to have a render props, especially to get data, because when so on our repository one here. Actually, in here I was doing that already. I just don't have anything written there because I had errors. I had too many calls to GitHub, so I was not getting the real data. I was getting an error, so that has to be handled sometimes.
You had too many calls to GitHub?
Yeah, that happens. I mean, you have a limited of the amount of calls you can make to their API, basically. Most of the companies have that. Otherwise, it's a bit crazy to handle. So in here I was doing like, oh, if there is an error, then do this, if what, then do that. That should be a render props to do, because it would be so much easier that everything gets handled there, and then you just call a component saying like, give me all the data, and then you have data, you have error, you have loading if you want. but yeah, again, render props is really good to isolate your logic somewhere.
Yeah.
As you can see here. I mean, basically in here you can create a calculator and then make very different calculators, and you don't need to update the logic all the time. Because again, in here we can very easily just switch things around, right, on this component here. Because again, the order does not matter at all. Like nothing matters in here because it's only the logic that it's on the other side. So this one still goes up and forward, and still this one only goes down. And now we can, for instance, put another one all the way down here, saying increment +1, and probably we need increment here. So you have exactly the same logic, and the logic is central here. And then in here, you just use whatever you want in whatever way you want. So again, sometimes you might stumble upon this type of problems of, I need to create this logic, and you do it and everything's fine, and then suddenly you're doing another component and you find yourself writing exactly the same thing. If you're doing the same exact logic you just wrote, then it means you can reuse it somehow. And if the logic requires state, requires this, requires that, then you can create a render props style, and the logic gets centralized, and then you show it in different places as whatever you want.
So just to confirm, Marco, so for every component, the one who calls the function is actually holding the data. The data does not go away. For example, with a handle delete or handle edit, whatever the data that it holds to, it stays on itself.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. So that's the really part that is confusing with me with React, because I don't know which part part that is the data still this part, or do I need to return it or anything?
Yeah, but for instance, one again, this is not that easy, but does it update? No. Oh yeah, no. ID 0 * 0. Oh yeah, it has there. Oh yeah, because this changed the parents, so it kind of reloaded the children again. Because as you can see here, and this is the React inspector thing. So we have the repositories, which I mean we don't see, but it's the wrapper here, and then in each one of them we have this repository. And now in here we can see that each one of them actually has an onDelete, as a handle edit. I mean, in here we cannot see what's exactly the parameters we are sending.
Yeah.
But each one of them has one of those. So whenever it's called, like whenever this one calls, only calls whatever it has. It doesn't, of course, because it's sent from the parent, then it tells the parent like, oh, I just called this, do something about it. But it's specific for, so the data gets propagated through all of them, basically. But again, it's the data that we gave to, it's the same thing of name. You can imagine, it's just that the function is a bit more, you cannot see that easy.
Each component, let's say, like over there, is like each component holds its own data, like encapsulates the data, and whatever action you give to that component is going to only to handle for that component.
Yeah, even though when you're writing it, we only wrote one repository component, right? But we can have a million of them, as long as we make sure that the key is unique. If not, we have an error. But we can create as many as we want, and each one of them has its own state, its own data, its own everything, basically. Okay.
How much resource does that use? Like, you know, if you have like a lot of data on a page, This one pagination comes in.
I mean, how can we see that?
Yeah, because a website can be slow for several reasons.
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
slow
yeah.
connection and this and that, and a lot of data, loading a lot of data. But when it comes, like, let's say you just said, like, you can have like a million repositories,
Mhm.
right? Each one has its own state and its own data, its own action, everything is encapsulated. How much resource does that take from the browser and the computer and stuff like that?
Not much. Let's just try to find some example. I mean, here is a bit tricky to do that, but which
Well,
one
I'm
would
assuming
have?
that's of course, because this is like Facebook uses it and they
Yeah,
have
yeah, yeah,
billions
yeah.
of people. So
Yeah, but again, Facebook might use it in a little bit of a different way. Let's say it's always can always be a bit trickier. But I mean, for instance, if we check this website uses React, and we can see here it has the React thingy. And probably when we get that down here, like each one of this is a React component. And as you can see, I mean, its Clocardies, it has like millions of ads here. And you can go as much as you want. Of course, that eventually might get slow, but again, if a user is having fun doing this, I mean, it's okay to be a bit slow, But the website does not break, and your page does not get crazy slow because of it.
it's also likely you would not use that way.
Yeah, but for instance, as you can see, like there is a very long scroll here of elements already, and it's again what makes your page slow actually is these ads here, is the banners. Not this is very, very fast. It's very well performant. It's not something like insane. So I was actually thinking on where do I have the
You took some more trickery, but you took some trickery with braces and
yeah, because
tags.
there is a lot of
But
records.
it works now.
Yeah, but as long as you keep it outside of the condition, that's what it's needed. So yeah. No, we still should make a recap of all the stuff. I'm just trying to figure out if I forgot something here, and I don't think I did. So, wait. So, for instance, when you look at our repositories component, which, when you think about visual component, only starts here on line 57, right? And everything between line 8 and line 57 is logic. Yeah. It's handle this, handle that, fetch data, right? Do all these things. So this would be like a very, very good use case of let's separate the logic from the component. Now, when we look at it, it's like, oh, but we only need the data. Here we don't, we won't use this data anywhere else, and we won't use the delete, edit anywhere else. So why do we need that? Again, we don't need it. But if we would, if let's say you want to have, in one side of the page, you have the list with the delete. On the other side of the page, you have the list with the edit, the same list. Then, instead of creating a very big component, Then you move all this logic into a component like this, where you only do the logic and you give back to the render all the available functions. You can delete, you can add new, you can edit, you can do anything. And then this one would just, it would look exactly the same, because it would just consume whatever functions this one would return. So the same way we have this, all the increment, decrement, count, we have a double there. We could have anything there. But in here, we are only using parts of it. On a footer, we are using other parts. So it is a way to centralize your logic so that if you need to duplicate something, you do not duplicate code. You duplicate visual maximum.
Because right now that logic is only tied to that component. But if you have like other sections of the website that would have different type of data that would need the same actions, then you could. That's when you could actually use that logic.
Yeah, yeah. But for instance, the thing about this render props is that the logic is not shared. So for instance, if you want the example I just said, if you want a list in one side to edit and another list in the other side to delete, if you would change one, the other one would not update, because they are different components. They would have different, the same way that the counter here, I mean this count here goes up and this one is not changing. This one can go down, right? And the logic still happens here. It's just that this creates a state per time it gets used. So somewhere here.
No, what I meant, I mean, you said the logic is not shared, but it's what I meant was like, you know, it's just like the button example you gave. Let's say right now you have your repositories there, but if you were to have like 5 different pages with all of our repositories, then you could use that same logic, like the star button, the delete for each one of us.
Yeah. Yes, but that would we could still use a render props for that, but we could always still use this component for that without repeating a lot of code, because basically we would just need a different user here.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You just create like, you know, page for Marco,
Yeah,
page for
but
Cat.
But it's always about thinking what's the cost of doing it, and by cost means work for you as well, because again the same thing that we did with children, the render props is something that is not you don't have to use it all the time. It's just like, does it make it easier to, if you're writing a lot of logic repeated, then maybe you can do this. But a very important thing is that, for instance, in here we have a counter, in here we have another counter, but they have different states. They behave differently, because even though the logic is all here, but they have different instances, so the logic is not shared at all between them. And that's a very important thing from render props to know. Okay. So now I think we should have a look at everything we know right now, because next time we'll talk about router, of course. That's good. So what we've seen today is that we can pass components as children, right? We saw that on maybe GitLab, I think. GitHome, not GitLab. So we can send components as children of other components, and we just need to make sure we use children there, and then gets printed. Completely fine. Whatever we send will get printed. Again, this is no magic, because it's no different than doing an H1 and then send text into it. When you think about it, it's a little bit similar. Context, something really, really important if you want to have shared data across your website, across all your components, whatever you want, either language, theme, database connections. To be honest, data itself could be sent into context as long as it's not a lot of data. And if you ask how much is a lot of data, we don't know. Right, nobody knows. It's the real answer is like, if it's a lot of data, it's bad. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
Mm.
How many
You
keys?
just know.
I mean, if it becomes too much.
Do you have to pull up an Amazon truck to transfer the
Yeah,
data?
no, but if it becomes too complex, then you might be doing something wrong. That's basically, I think that's where you should stop.
Yeah.
So context used for things that are simple but needed to update in general. Again, the best example is language, and we just did one, so feel free to use it, a language thing. And then render props. And render props, again, it's for code reusability, but it might be very, very tricky to find a use case that completely fits. I'm not actually not sure if the homework asks you to do something with render props. It might, but
For week one.
yeah, the next one might. But if it does, again, you have this counter as an example. If it asks you something, it should be something similar. I don't know. Actually, I haven't seen it. So, and of course, the part of how a function can get triggered from parent to children. And we have this example. I will put this online also so that you can see and play around with it. And I think that kind of would be it. And are there questions?
The render props, it acts like it's a class where it has its own methods and it has its own properties.
Yeah, you can say that. I mean, for instance, when you think about the use state, but the use state always brings value and function.
Mm.
It's very similar of what the function render prop does. Is like you call it and it gives you two things that you can play with, basically. But yeah, I mean, we are not using classes because everything is a function here, but you could imagine as that.
Because the counter has its own specific method, like increment,
Yeah.
and global. Yeah.
And then provides that method as an API to the clients, which is basically what the class does. So yeah, you could imagine as that. But yeah, I think that would be it for today.